I want to talk this evening a bit about the Buddha and what we mean by Buddha in our tradition. Obviously every school of Buddhism recognizes the Buddha as the founder. What we find, I think, is very characteristic of the Theravada is that the connection is very strong to the historical person who achieved Buddhahood in India at a certain date, which traditionally is given as his death at 563 BC, is how the calendar is calculated. But it's very likely inaccurate. Truth is, in ancient Indian chronology is very fuzzy and nobody really knows for sure his dates. But there was a human being born in the very north of India who attained Buddhahood in this age. The attainment of Buddhahood, Samma Sambodhi, is considered to be an extraordinarily rare development. And this again is something that's approached a little bit differently in other schools of Buddhism. In Zen, they sometimes say all beings are Buddha from beginningless time. And Mahayana in general talks about the Buddha nature inherent in beings. But in the Theravada, becoming a Buddha is extremely rare. Just how rare it is, consider that there can only be one Buddha at a time in a span of 10,000 world systems. And this shows up in several places in the suttas when the Buddha gives a particularly important discourse or some other miraculous event. Devas from 10,000 world systems assemble to witness, because this is called the field of birth, Jatiketa, that this Buddha is the one and only in 10,000 world systems. So it's very rare in spatial terms, but also in terms of chronology and time. An age of the world, a kappa, from beginning to end of a world system, can have anywhere from 0 to 5 Buddhas. At the beginning of the unfolding of a new world system, one of the first, or the very first living thing that appears on the surface of the earth is a lotus. And Devas come down from the Pure Land, the Suddhavasa, to examine the portents. They pick the lotus and open it. If there's, say that there's a lotus plant, and if it has no buds at all, that means there'll be no Buddhas. And it might have up to 5 buds. And then they pick the buds and they open them, and inside are the requisites of a bhikkhu: robes and bowl and belt and a water strainer and so forth. And they keep those in the stupa up in the Brahma world. And when the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be, leaves home, makes the great renunciation and leaves home, one of these Devas comes down and presents him with the requisites that's been kept from the beginning of the kappa. There's a list somewhere in the commentaries of like a chronological list of the Buddhas going back many hundreds of kappas. And there are great spans of time. In fact, the most kappas have no Buddhas. There might be hundreds or even thousands of kappas go by without a Buddha. And then you'll get 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 up to 5. This present kappa is considered an auspicious kappa because we have 5 Buddhas. And Buddha Gautama, who's the one that we know, is the 4th. the Buddha becomes a Buddha through a very long process. It's the Bodhisattva career. Yeah? And this is something that is a cardinal difference between the Theravada and the Mahayana, is the definition of a Bodhisattva. Sanskrit is Bodhisattva, and Mahayana school basically recommends that everyone become a Bodhisattva. You take a Bodhisattva vow not to enter final Nibbana until all beings are liberated. It's different in the Theravada. Someone who is a Bodhisattva is someone on the path to Buddhahood. And you can make an aspiration to become a Buddha, but it's not binding and it's not really effective until such time as it's made before a living Buddha. And this is one of the meanings of the epithet of the Buddha, the Blessed One, Bhagawa, because he has been blessed by a previous Buddha. In the case of Gautama, it was Dipankara Buddha, who lived, I think it was 93 kappas ago, very long time ago. And the Bodhisattva at that time made an aspiration to seek Buddhahood, and Dipankara then made the prophecy, yes, you shall attain Buddhahood, and your name shall be Gautama, and your caste shall be Katiya, and your two chief disciples will be Moggallana and Sariputta, and so forth. And then, having made the aspiration for Buddhahood, he then has to spend many hundreds of lifetimes taking birth again and again, seeking to perfect the paramis. And this is a central attribute of the Buddha. The Buddha is one who has perfected the paramis. The paramis are 10 spiritual qualities: Dana, Sila, Nekama, Panya, Virya, Satya, Kanti, Aditana, Metta, and Upekkha. That is, Dana, generosity; Sila is virtue, or keeping of the precepts; Nekama is renunciation; Panya is wisdom; Virya is energy, or effort; Satya is truth; Aditana is determination; Kanti is patience; Metta is loving kindness; and Upekkha is equanimity. These are 10 spiritual virtues that it's generally considered that they're gains that if you make gains in your paramis, will carry on into subsequent lifetimes. And you don't need to have them perfected to become an arahant, a fully awakened arahant, but to become a Buddha, one has to have them completely purified and perfected. And this means perfecting them to a degree that we would consider superhuman. In the Jataka story, where the Buddha develops equanimity, the Bodhisattva developing equanimity, he was born into a royal family, and as a small child, his father, the king, went mad and came to believe that his infant son was some kind of a terrible demon who was going to destroy the kingdom, and he ordered him killed. And the mother is weeping and begging not to harm the child, and the executioners sawing the limbs off one by one, arms and legs and then the head. And the Bodhisattva, even as an infant, brought forth equanimity to develop the same feeling towards himself, his mad father, the cruel executioner, and the weeping mother. He had the same balanced, equanimous state towards all of them. So this is a superhuman level of equanimity. In the very last Jataka in the book, which is a great favorite in Thailand, the Vasantara Jataka. The story seems in some respects a bit off-putting to Westerners often. The Buddha was Bodhisattva. I keep saying the Buddha. I should call him the Bodhisattva before he's enlightened. The Bodhisattva was a king, and he had made a vow he was going to practice generosity to perfection, so that whenever anyone asked for him to give, he would not think about it or refuse. He would immediately give whatever was asked of him. So the first incident of importance in the story is that a rascally Brahmin, and this is a trope in the Jatakas, the Brahmins are always rascals and scheming. This rascally Brahmin has heard about the generosity of the king, and he wants to profit from it. And the king is out in a procession in the town riding on the royal elephant. It's a white elephant. You know, we have the phrase in English, a white elephant is for something rare, and it's a reason for that. An albino elephant in Indian culture was considered an extremely auspicious, wonderful creature to have in your kingdom. It was considered extremely rare and lucky. You know, so this is the pride and joy of the kingdom, was this elephant. And the Brahmin, of course, immediately asked, "Give me the elephant." So the king dismounts and gives him the elephant. And the townspeople are absolutely outraged. His king has given away our beautiful white elephant. So they overthrow him and depose him from being the king, and they drive him and his family out into the wilderness. And this is another trope that appears often in the Jatakas, is the king, and often the king with his wife and sometimes with children attached, living in exile in the forest in a little hut. You know? This is what happened to King Vasantara. And it chances one day that another Brahmin comes by and says, he has two sons. He says, "Give me your boys. I want them for slaves." And he says, "Yes, I cannot refuse." And he drives the boys down the road with a stick. You know, they're enslaved now. Yeah. And then this causes the throne of Sakka, king of the Tawatingsa gods, to tremble whenever some act of great surpassing virtue is occurred on the earth. And Sakka becomes alarmed because he thinks someone else is going to be reborn as Sakka and overthrow him. So he investigates, and he sees that Vasantara doesn't want to become Sakka, he wants to become Buddha. So, that's okay then. So Sakka then says, the next thing that's going to happen is somebody else is going to come along and demand his wife. And I can't let that happen to the queen. She's a very virtuous lady, and that would be a travesty. So he goes to earth and takes the form of a Brahmin and demands the wife. And the king gives away the wife, who was also then she was later reborn as Yasodhara, Siddhartha Gautama's wife in the subsequent birth. It was the same being. And then Sakka takes her up to heaven and puts her in a comfy palace and says, "Just wait it out. Things are going to be okay. I'm just, you're safe and sound here. Don't worry." And back on earth, Vasantara goes through various adventures, and finally, the ending of the story is he gets back his kids, and he gets back his wife, and he gets back his elephant and the kingdom and all that. But he had practiced this extreme generosity that we even think, from our Western bias, we think, how horrible, he gives his kids away. But this is the supreme generosity. So this was the completion. That was the 10th and last of the paramis for him to complete. And now he had completed the Bodhisattva path, and his next existence is in Tusita heaven, where he existed for 57 million of our years as a Tusita Dewa. And then the time comes when the other Dewas say, "Venerable Sir, it's time for you to take rebirth and become a Buddha." But first he makes an examination if things are suitable for him to take a birth, and he examines the time. Buddhas only appear in the world when human lifespan is decreasing and has not yet reached 100 years. So, okay. Then he checks the continent. He must be born in Jambudipa, the southern continent. And the country, he must be born in the middle country, the north central India, basically. And then he examines the family or the clan to make sure it's suitable. It must be a clan of either the Brahmin or the Katiya caste, and whichever one is dominant at the time. So he's born into the highest caste. And finally, examines the quality of the mother. The mother must be a good, virtuous woman. And Queen Maya was that. So then he takes his final birth. And the whole sequence of the birth is archetypal for all Buddhas whatsoever. The same kind of sequences of events happen. The four great kings come to earth and stand as guards in the four corners of the queen's bedchamber while she's holding the Bodhisattva in her womb. And then she gives birth out of doors underneath a tree. In the case of the historical Buddha, Queen Maya was traveling back, as was a custom at the time, to give birth in her parental home. And she was caught on the road and went into labor. And she gave birth holding on to a sala tree. And she gives birth standing up. This is another of the archetypal details. And then the newborn child, immediately after birth, he takes 7 steps, and a lotus grows under his foot at each step. Then he raises his finger in the air and decrees, "I am supreme in all the world." So there's miraculous events associated with the birth. And there's a long list, actually, in one of the commentaries of all sorts of wonderful things that happen at these various moments, like the Buddha's birth, the time of his enlightenment, the time of his first sermon, and the time of his death, which include trees bursting into flower out of season, and the most striking is a brilliant light that fills the 10,000 world systems, and even fills the space between the worlds, where there's the hell of darkness, or beings are reborn in this utter darkness, and this is the only time they have light, is these miraculous events in the Buddha's life. Now, anything to do with the Bodhisattva and the Buddha is considered to be not of mundane importance, but of cosmic significance. It shakes 10,000 world systems. But for all this, he was a flesh and blood man, an ordinary human being, and in that sense, he had the same biology and the same difficulties as any human being to begin with. And he's born with 32 marks of a Mahaparisa, a great man. There's certain marks on the body that the Brahmins, examining the infant, determine this child shall be either a Buddha or a Chakravarti, which means a world-conquering monarch. So his father, King Suddhodana, being a worldly man, said, "Oh, that sounds good. Let's have him be the Chakravarti." So he wanted to keep the Bodhisattva from developing his spiritual tendencies. He wanted him to be a warrior and become a conquering emperor. And the clan he was born into, the Sakya clan, is an interesting history too. They're one of the premier Aryan clans in India, and probably their customs and ways were closer to the old original Vedic Aryans than the more urbanized kingdoms further south. They were probably like very old-fashioned at the time, clinging to the old traditions. And their own mythology is that their progenitor, the first of their house, was the god of the sun, Surya. So you see that sometimes, occasionally in the Pali, when they're listing like honorable attributes or epithets of the Buddha, one of them is kinsman of the sun. And this is the meaning of that the Sakyans believed they were descended from the sun god. So the king Suddhodana wanted to keep Siddhartha Gautama from seeing the ordinary miseries of the world. So they made a great effort to keep him from seeing death or sickness or old age. And at the same time, they tried to immerse him in sensory pleasure. Built him a pleasure palace filled with all fine things and staffed with dancing girls. And there's one phrase where the Buddha is reminiscing about his time as in his early days, and he said, I lived in great luxury, and in my palace there were many dancers and many musicians, and none of them were men. So he was completely surrounded with this sensuality. But then, having completed the paramis, the course is set. He's not going to escape becoming a Buddha, even if he wanted to. So at one point, when he's out on a chariot ride with his charioteer Channa, they see a sick person, and somebody coughing up blood and shaking, and Siddhartha says, "What's this? What's the matter with that fellow?" And Channa says, "He's sick." "What does that mean, sick? I haven't heard this word before." It's something that happens to people. Their body starts to go wrong and they have problems. And he says, "Oh, I can't bear it," and goes back to the palace and broods on this. And the same thing happens with an old person hobbling on a stick and a dead person lying on the ground. And finally, the fourth one is he sees a samana, a seeker, a spiritual seeker in robes wandering out of the town gate. And that triggers something deep in his heart. And after each of these incidents, he broods on it. And the way it's described, it's if a modern psychologists were to examine Siddhartha at that time, they would decide he was depressed. Say that he lost interest in all things, and he just kind of lay on his couch and couldn't find any pleasure in anything, and very low energy, and externally looked like he was depressed, but he was confronting the nature of dukkha. And this is something we all have to go through in our spiritual journey, is confronting the nature of dukkha. And if you're not ready for it, it can be very hard. But there's this passage that the mind has to go through. So he came to the resolution in the end to leave the home life and go and seek spiritual liberation. And he left the town. And this is the first temptation of Mara. Was Mara appeared to him outside the town gates and misidentified himself. He lied and said, I am Vasawati, so one of the high gods. And says, I honor your resolution, and but if you return to the palace now, I assure you within 7 days the wheel will appear for you, and you will become a Chakrawati. You will be a world conqueror. This is a whole another part of the mythos, is the Chakrawati with the wheel that appears in the sky, and he conquers the whole world. And the Buddha, recounting this episode, he says, "And I threw away the rulership of all four continents like a clot of spittle." So he was completely fearless and not to be tempted by even by the rulership of the entire world. So he went forth and he spent 6 years in extreme austerity. And it said the reason he had to endure 6 years of austerity before becoming enlightened was that in one of his previous births he had insulted a previous Buddha. His friend wanted him to go and see the Buddha, and he said, "I don't want to see these shaven-headed fools," something like that. So he spent 6 years starving himself and practicing all kinds of extreme austerities, which was kind of a thing in India and still is. That there are people that do these things that were like the 5 fires, sitting under a hot sun on one of the hottest days of the year, and it gets really hot in northern India in the summer, and having a raging fire on 4 sides of you at the same time, and just sitting like that, and not eating, extreme fasting. And the Buddha, when he was old, there's a sutta where he's reminiscing with Ananda about his austerities. And he says, "At first I was eating a handful of rice a day and no more. Then I went down to half a handful. Then I went down to 7 grains, then to 3. Then for a long time I subsisted on a single grain of rice a day. And you might think, Ananda, that in those days the rice grains were bigger than they are today, but in reality they were at most the same size." So this is one of the suttas where I think that the Buddha really displays a sense of humor. And some of the other passages in that sutta, it's describing how skinny he got, how emaciated he got from this starving fast. And it says, like, when I went to touch my belly, I could feel my backbone. And it says, my ribs stuck out like crazy rafters. And some of these phrases have a more comical sound in the Pali because there's like rhyming and alliteration going on in this passage. But in any case, he practiced these extreme austerities. And at some point during those 6 years, he encountered 2 teachers who he followed for a period. And they took him up to the 3rd and 4th formless jhanas, the base of nothingness and the base of neither perception or non-perception. And this episode illustrates the supreme spiritual genius of the Buddha, that he was able to experience these states, master them in fact, which anyone else in India would have considered to be an amazing accomplishment. And his teachers had told him this is like the supreme state. There's nothing beyond this. And he was able to say, no, this is not the end. This is still conditioned. And so he went and continued on his way. And he picked up 5 disciples of his own, and they practiced together. And in the end, when he does attain to Buddhahood, he decides that his extreme austerities is not the way to go. And he accepts from a humble woman, a young girl, a bowl of milk rice. Sujata was her name. And he accepted from her a bowl of milk rice. And this is said to be the most auspicious gift ever made, is the bowl of milk rice by Sujata. It's the most karmically potent gift possible. The gift of food before the Buddha's enlightenment. But his 5 disciples, seeing him eating the rice they said he's reverted to luxury. He's gone astray. We're not going to associate with him anymore. And they wandered off. And he sat under the Bodhi tree. And there are various descriptions of that night. There's the episode of the temptations of Mara, that Mara tried to dislodge him from the Bodhi seat. And this is another archetypal element, that all the Buddhas in this world system, all 5 of them, will become enlightened on exactly the same spot. This is the Bodhi Manda. It's the most potent spot on the surface of the earth. There's a Jataka of a king riding a flying elephant through the air, and the elephant won't cross over the Bodhi Manda, because to be above the Bodhi Manda is disrespect to the sacred spot. So the Buddha is sitting on his seat, and Mara unleashes all these ferocious attacks on him with fiery hot ash and great torrents of water and one thing after another, and none of them affect the Buddha. The ash just turns to lotus petals as they fall on him. And although the great torrent of water tops the palm trees and wipes out villages, it doesn't even get the hem of his robe wet. There's all this one after the other, and then Mara unleashes his armies, great hordes of demons. And all the devas who had assembled around the Buddha, at that point they fled away. And they were terrified. But the Buddha, now completely alone, without even the devas around him, remained immovable on the Bodhi seat. And Mara challenges him and says, "You don't have the right to that seat." And the Buddha says, "I have earned the right by perfection of the paramis." And Mara says, "So have I. And here are my witnesses. Haven't I, fellows?" And all these demons, "Yes, yes, yes." And the Buddha says, "That may be as you say, and you have these for witness, but I have no living witness. But I call the earth to witness." And he put his hand on the earth, and the earth cried out in a great voice, "Yes, he has perfected the paramis." And that's basically the end of Mara's attack. And that's a motive you'll see often in a motif you'll see often in Buddhist art, is the earth-touching Buddha. And there are more elaborate versions of that story in later literature, but the point was that the Buddha was calling the earth to witness. One passage describes his experience as the arising of 3 knowledges, the Tivijja, which is a play on words in a sense, because the Brahmanical culture recognized the 3 knowledges as the 3 Vedas. The Buddha's 3 knowledges were quite different. The first watch of the night, the Buddha penetrated to all his past lives, going back many thousands of kappas. He clearly saw his lives. He knew, such was my name, such was my clan, such was my pleasure, such was my pain. Passing from there, I was reborn there, and then my name was such and such, my clan was such and such, and so on. So he had complete recall of his past lives. And in the second watch of the night, he saw with his vision, his spiritual vision, he saw beings rising and falling in the universe, coming into existence and passing away and reappearing elsewhere. Then in the third watch of the night, he attained to what's called the destruction of the asavas. The asavas meaning the deep defilements, the root defilements, meaning his being was absolutely purified. There was nothing left of any trace of any kind of defiled state of mind. And this was said to occur just before dawn as the planet Venus crested the horizon. And the Buddha attained to Buddhahood, Sammasam Buddha. fully enlightened by himself. Now the idea of Buddha means, essentially it means awake. That's what the mundane meaning of the word Buddha is, one who is awake. From bodheti, to wake up. So one who's fully awake. So there's no darkness in the consciousness. There's nothing hidden. The Arahant also has the same penetration, the same experience of nibbana as the Buddha, but the Buddha is superior in that he has completed the paramis. And this manifests in various qualities of the Buddha, such as his complete recollection of past lives, his ability to know the nature of beings, which made him a perfect teacher because he would know exactly where people were in their journey, and he'd be able to apply his teaching exactly. The Buddha spent 45 years wandering northern India teaching, and he established the sasana, the religion, and the sangha, the order. So his legacy persists to this day. But this was not initially a sure thing. Immediately after his awakening, he was inclined to just spend the rest of his life enjoying the bliss of enlightenment. And Brahma Sahampati, very high level Brahma being, came down and on bended knee begged the Buddha to get up from his seat and teach. He said, for the benefit of those with little dust in their eyes. There are beings perishing in the world for lack of hearing the Dhamma. The situation is hopeless if they don't have a chance to hear the Dhamma. They're caught in the snares of samsara. And the terrible process of birth and death and birth again will continue for them without respite. So the Buddha, out of compassion, determined to spend the rest of his life teaching the Dhamma. And the first ones he taught were the 5 disciples that had abandoned him. And when they saw him coming, they said amongst themselves, oh, here comes that Gautama, that worthless fellow, gorging himself on milk rice. Let's ignore him, don't pay any attention to him. But then when he got closer, he was so radiant they couldn't restrain themselves, and they spontaneously, made him a seat and brought him water and a cloth for washing his feet and so on. Paid him respect. And he gave the first sermon, which is the turning the wheel of the Dhamma sermon, in which he enunciated the 4 Noble Truths. And one of the disciples, Kondanyo, attained to the state of stream enterer. And this was an event of great cosmic importance. In a sense, it's more important than the enlightenment of the Buddha himself, because if the Buddha had not transmitted the Dhamma, it would have just died with him. But by Kondanyo attaining to stream entry, there was a transmission of the Dhamma, a turning of the wheel. The Devas of the 10,000 world systems rejoiced. So the gist of it is that the Buddha, who has founded this Buddhist teachings, was both a flesh and blood ordinary human being and a remarkable transcendent being. And I think that's very important to hold both of those concepts. There's a saying of Dogen, the Zen master. He says, if you see the old man Shakyamuni, do you see the Tathagata? And if you see the Tathagata, do you see the old man Shakyamuni? Shakyamuni being the way the Mahayana usually names the Buddha. Historically, there have been tendencies both ways to undermine this vision of the Buddha in these dual aspects. Some of the schools of Buddhism later tended to deify the Buddha, make him into some kind of a godlike figure that had no connection with humanity. There's one late Mahayana Indian text that says that all the story of Siddhartha Gautama and his early life and his struggles and austerities and so on never happened. That the Buddha was actually just appeared on earth fully formed, sitting on a golden lotus. And this story he gave as a teaching story for people. In fact, he sat motionless for 45 years on this golden lotus and uttered nothing but a single note continually. And the Arahants were the only ones who could understand the hidden teachings embedded in this wave of sound. And they taught the teachings. So they completely severed any connection of the Buddha to humankind. On the other hand, in some modern presentations of the Buddha, people want to rationalize it all, take out all the sort of miraculous elements and psychologize it. It comes down to, the Buddha was just like a really wise philosopher. And nothing more to it than that. But if the Buddha's teaching is worth anything, the Buddha was transcendent. His penetration was transcendent of this reality altogether. That's the third noble truth. And that's the great wonder and hope and guiding light of the Buddha's teaching, is that there is something other than this samsaric conditioned existence. And the Buddha is one who accessed that transcendent unconditioned and then was able to enunciate the path leading to it for the benefit of beings. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.